Well, welcome back. I hope you all got coffee. And we're here for a set of conversations over what these civic spaces might be like and what the problems and organizations of those civic spaces might be. Do we have an order? I think we'll work our way down the table and organize it then around questions and opportunities for discussion.
Sure. Well, good morning, buenos dias. How is everyone this morning? Good. I am Anthea Hartig. I have the honor of serving as the Elizabeth MacMillan Director of your National Museum of American History, just down the street. Please come visit. All of you people who haven't been there in a while. I already asked Andy that, so I knew. But I think what we're going to do is just really briefly go down the line. So I won't say too much because I'm really looking forward to this conversation. But I do want to position just some initial reactions and reflections on your great presentation, Andy, and to really think about the ways in which we're seeing the museum really as a center for democratic discourse. We are honored, of course, to welcome about 12 million people last year, 3 million in situ, and about 12 million online. So you think about that as a really humbling superpower. And we've turned the museum to try and empower people to create a more just and compassionate future by preserving and exploring and understanding the complexities of the American past. And so we think a lot about what it means to be American, generally not an American. I think there's a nice kind of embrace of leaving that little two-word out. We also think a lot about the ways in which exhibits, interpretation, scholarship, through material culture then do create those civic spaces. And the beauty, of course, of having a free museum open 364 days a year is that you actually really never know who's going to be standing next to you. You have to make a choice, or your parents had to make a choice if you were 13 or 14 or 5 or 1-year-old to come to the museum in the first place. But there is a phenomenal kind of civitas, if you will, to embracing that remarkable mixture of people. And especially since we've set our eyes on becoming the most accessible, inclusive, relevant, and sustainable place we can be by 2030, and we'll know we've succeeded if the demographies of our visitors match the demographies of the nation. So it's a big challenge, certainly. I want to say something about this place because up until recently, of course, it was the museum, and we're grateful, I think, for Johns Hopkins for continuing the building's life, but it emblazoned across the front the First Amendment. And one of the things I found really fascinating about, I would like to actually hear you say more about the MAGA hat that 14-year-olds buy, mostly white young males buy on their way into our museums, mostly from immigrant peddlers who don't have licenses, who are trying to make a living. So there's just unpack that little moment where you're given $20 and that's what you spend your money on. So that's often what comes into our museum. But I think the First Amendment also shows us the boundaries of some of the ways in which freedom of speech in particular cannot infringe upon our bodies, our health, our safety. And that, I think, is one of the key moments that I was really reflecting on, Andy, because I think that those signs that we believe we know, those declarations in a way of mimicking in part the Declaration of Independence, and I think we're all eager to talk about 2026. You just ask us and we'll go. But those all happened. Those signs popped up in the summer of 2020, and I think it's essential for us to remember that. I used to call them a cascade of crises: constitutional, viral, racial, gender, did I already mention constitution, climate, environment, right? But it was actually kind of a cyclone of crises. So I think context for those signs coming up is essential because that we were in lockdown, because we were seeing what ended up being 1.2 million people dying, because we were seeing murder after murder of innocent African Americans, rise in anti-Asian hate crimes, of course the fall of Roe, say the 24th, Yes. 2 years ago today. So very auspicious that we're all in Washington. So I do think that our opportunities are vast, right, to help contextualize. I want to do 3D printing of Gilda's wand from The Wizard of Oz, because you have to pick the good witch, right? And I want to tap everyone on the head and give them context. Wouldn't it be great? So much of our work would be done, right? I just tap them on the head. I gave you the gift of context. Go forth in life, in our museum, wherever spaces you are in, and acknowledge our shared humanity. So anyway, I'm incredibly excited about this opportunity. I'm very grateful to be among so many fellow leaders, and I'll pause now with my gratitude to both the Smithsonian, to my sister directors, and to the wonderful Museum Studies program here at Johns Hopkins. Thank you.
Thanks, Anthea. I'm Laura Huerta Migus. I'm the Deputy Director for the Office of Museum Services at the Institute of Museum and Library Services. And we are an independent federal agency that does research, policy, and grant making in support of the nation's libraries, archives, and museums. I want to take a moment to talk about what that framework means for this conversation. So I think a lot of times folks think that IMLS provides services, and the services that we provide is money. That is a significant part of it, but that's actually not what the services refer to in the name of our agency. We actually exist to invest in the services that libraries, archives, museums, and related cultural organizations provide to their communities and to the American public. And a critical frame for those services is about relevance, is about accessibility, and is also about being available as spaces to community. This is, I think, really critical in this conversation today that we're going to have about museums and democracy and civic spaces. Because we've just, through our policy and research work, completed a first pilot for a national museum survey. FYI, there's no federal policy data set on museums. There will be at the end of next year. But what is really important about our first pass at that information is that we're now counting 22,500 physical museums available across the country. That's more sites than public library branches. That's more sites than McDonald's. That's more sites than Starbucks. So if we just think, I think, Andy, the notion that you talk about gathering and being, I think about what you were saying about being in relationship with each other as what civic life is. Just thinking from a very practical perspective, I feel like that's also part of my job as one of the feds up here, is to be very practical, is to really think about the amount of real estate that we offer for people to be in human dialogue with each other. And then what does service to community look like through that lens? Yeah. What do our spaces look like through that lens? What are the experiences that we're offering contribute to people feeling like they are part of where they're from or where they're at when they're visiting museum spaces? So those are the things that are really not just on my mind, but on our mind at IMLS as an agency, and I think there's a lot of juicy discussion up here from also my 3 pages of notes, Andy, from your presentation, but very grateful and honored to be here today.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Oh, see, you're tuckered out. Go get more coffee, please, after Laura and Anthony. I already did all the talking. My name is Vedet Coleman-Robinson, and I am the president and CEO of the Association of African American Museums. Over here in AAAM land, we have a lot of things going on and things that I think are relevant to this conversation. Number one, since our founding, all of our museums start in our community. The Anacostia Community Museum, in which Dr. Melanie Adams is the director, is one of our pillar museums. all of our museums start in the communities in which they serve, to include the National Museum of African American History and Culture. When I say that that museum in particular is serving the community, I know you guys are like, but it's on the mall. How's it servicing the community? Well, it started in the community. The collections came from the community. The programs come from the community. They listen. They have all types of listening sessions and the like. And all of that is built on the blueprint of the Association of African American Museums. Our members helped with advocacy to make sure that that museum was up and running, and to also make sure that the legislation, which is also tethered to IMLS, was up and running as well. So we have a rich history over here in AAAM land. We have grown in membership over 240% since I started. Yes, go ahead and clap. My chair is over there, so please tell him all the good things about me after this conversation. But in all he is here. But in all seriousness, my job at AAAM is amazing. I get to sit and speak to our members about what they're doing in the communities, about these amazing, rapid response conversations that they're having. And I just want to share this one story with you because it touched my heart during the pandemic, and I know it's going to touch your heart right now. So when George Floyd was murdered, all of us were looking around. All of us were crying, just trying to figure out what is life. African Americans have been, tormented and tortured since the beginning. And what is America without us? And I remember getting a call from the National Civil Rights Museum in Memphis. And they said, Vedet, we're closed. I said, we're all closed. Join the club. And they just started laughing. And that was just a moment for us to break the ice. But the thing that was really important right after that conversation is they said, we're closed, but the community needs us. And I said, yes. So what are we going to do? I was not leaving Maryland, but I was going to help them virtually as much as possible. I was serious about not leaving a 15-mile radius from my home in Baltimore County during the pandemic. I know you guys are like, what? No, seriously, I was not leaving. Ask my chair. So what they did was the community wound up starting at the courthouse. And they started doing this march all throughout Memphis. And they stopped at the National Civil Rights Museum. While that museum was closed, they had reconciliation conversations. They had a conversation about what it was to be African American in this country, but more importantly, ways in which to move forward in healing. The other thing that the thing that I want all of you guys to understand about our museums is it's sacred land. Our museums are as coveted as the Black church and churches in general. When there are riots, our museums are not touched. They are protected. They are protected by the community because we started in the community. Also during the pandemic, one thing that came up a lot was I was getting these calls from a lot of museums that were not in their communities, but they were like, how do I get the community to come out? And I'm like, what community are you talking about? And I literally had to say, do you mean Black people? And the answer then was, yes, how do I get Black people to my museum? And then my question was, are you collecting? Are you having conversations? Are you doing programming, anything? Are you partnering with the African American Museum in your community that's been there since 1978? If the answer is no, get on it now. So as Lauda knows, I'm all about reaching across the table, the chairs, the sky. I don't care. I feel that all of us need to lock arms and just really think about how we want to move America forward, and we can do that through our museums. And I think I've taken up too much time. I know it's not my time.
No, it is.
It's not my show, but I will pass it on to Geri.
It's your time.
Oh, thank you, Geri.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me. I am not from the museum community, but I really was grateful for the opportunity to come here and to hear more about what you all are doing. So I'm Geri Mannion. I'm the managing director of the U.S. Democracy Portfolio at Carnegie Corporation, which is a private foundation founded by our donor, Andrew Carnegie, more than 100 years ago. And he had three aspects that he really always wanted us to concentrate on: education, peace and security. He was always against war. Hasn't been very successful, and democracy. And democracy's been really identified in many different ways. So even though we're more than 100 years, we've pretty much stuck with those three themes through the course of our history. And many of you know most of what we do is through libraries, and that actually we haven't actually built a library since like the 20s or the 30s. So it's more about like making sure that they continue to exist through our support for the American Libraries Association or Maine libraries. Our program on democracy is really focused on, and has since the 70s, on voting rights protections, ensuring that anybody who wants to vote should be able to vote. That includes low propensity voters, and we've continued to work on that. Election reform, trying to make it easier. And one of the things that has been forgotten from the 2020 election was that it was the largest turnout in the history, or I should say a century, in voting in this country. And that's because we made it easier, and we made it more convenient, and people could do things. My favorite was the drive-by voting in Texas, right? You could bring your family, and people were able to vote safely and security during COVID. We have also focused a lot on a very polarizing issue, which is immigration. We've been working on immigration reform for almost over 20 years, frankly, to try to see whether we could fix our broken immigration system. But more recently, given what we talked about this morning with Andy, is that our country is very polarized right now, and under our new leadership of Louise Richardson, who's our new president, we're really going to try to tackle mitigating polarization. Not an easy thing, and we know it's not going to be very quick to do. But we have sort of identified different areas that we think that will be helpful in going down that line, and that is everything from civic learning. There's not enough civic education anymore in the schools, bridging divides, elections and governance. We have electoral systems that make people pitted against each other. They're winner-take-all systems. There's always going to be somebody upset, regardless. Community service, particularly at the state level, and combating mis and disinformation, which is a really, really tricky thing. Obviously, given though we have more information now than we've ever had, a lot of it is really not only polarizing, but violent and hateful. And we need to figure out ways to mediate that. So that's what we're trying to do. One of the things I'll just mention quickly is, under the new sort of direction of our work, is we've recognized that civic engagement or civic institutions are lacking in many parts of the country, and we're trying to figure out ways to rebuild that, but not just through electoral issues, but just bringing people together. And we think museums, for example, because they are everywhere, they would be places where people could come together, have conversations, and actually learn that. And I am an optimist. I don't think things are as bad as it's put out to be by the media. I think most people at the local level in different areas really do want to talk to each other, really do like each other, and want to help each other. And we just have to figure out how to raise that up more.
Terrific. Thank you all. This is an extraordinary group that y'all have brought together, and I'm honored to be on the panel with. I wanted to start, Vedet in particular mentioned a lot about community. And this question of how we define community, the communities that museums are in, the communities that museums bring out, and also who gets included in that and who gets omitted from the ideas of what constitutes community. Anyone is welcome to jump in on this conversation about, and y'all as well are welcome to jump in on the conversation about how we think about the relationship between this sort of abstract concept of community. I loved your story about somebody saying, when you say community, you mean black people?
Yeah. In that moment, they did.
Yes.
But I think about, Melissa and Kajim, and when we're talking about community engagement, that's a whole different community, right? And I love our associations that are specific to cultural differences, but I also love how we all bring one another together. Absolutely. I'm sorry, my coffee is just kicking in, so I'm going to be doing a lot of but I'm here.
I can pick up a little and pass it to Anthea. So I think community. How long? An hour and a half?
Yeah.
Okay. So maybe a few things. Going back to context, writ large, around the whole practice of museuming, that instituting museums, is that this whole discipline and field has been on a trajectory around inside and outside walls, and we're still on that trajectory. And relatively recently, there's been critical mass that said, oh, maybe what those outside of our walls that come in, maybe they are just as important as what those inside the walls think and care about. So I think we have to recognize that that's still part of our paradigm in museums, inside and outside walls, and that just is a thing. That's not a value statement. And we are, and IMLS has been pushing for 20 years for museums, libraries, and archives to become community anchors, acknowledging that there needs to be work there and permission given and support given. So community is also thinking about inside outside. It's an othering. It is a delimiter about who's other. And then I think we also have to be very honest about using community as a code word for others, whoever that other is, without, again, saying it. I cannot write down frankness enough, Andy. Thank you so much, because sometimes community means Black people, sometimes it means poor people, sometimes it means disabled people, maybe it means people who don't like us. But we in this community, professional community of practice, use the word community very vaguely. And so I think that also it presents both an opportunity but a challenge as well at this point of our development in naming what the relationship is that we're trying to build and with whom. I'm sure
that's well said. Yeah, no, I think that we also are engaged in deep conversations and long conversations about community and audience.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of a blurriness, I think, with how we've defined and how we talk about both, that I think especially the great brain power and experience in this room can help really kind of tease apart. And to your point about how we use it as code. And to how we, kind of frame that otherness almost automatically 100%. By using it. I want to shift the conversation a little bit and think about the challenge that, that we embrace of having a national museum, and to your point about National Museum of African American History and Culture, Vedet, is that how does a national museum also be one of community? And I think community-based practices, which of course are, again, nothing new, been since, really since the start of so many museums across the country, and here, of course, with Anacostia, and the ways in which we learn from those practices over the last 50, 60 years, and I know you're going to get to a conversation about kind of the field itself and how we've grown up, but we've grown up in a post-civil rights movement world, scholarly, interpretively, place-based. We've grown up, of course, alongside this ongoing contestation over the Great American Paradox. I mean, next year will be 50 years since Edmund Morgan, for all you history geeks in the room, published American Slavery, American Freedom, which just lays out the governing paradox. He looks at Virginia, but lays out the governing paradox of a heinous form of inherited chattel slavery and the rise of American democracy, right? So, but we're still, in a way, talking about it as if it's a really new conversation and a brand new paradox, when of course it has such historic roots. But when we think about community, then, like, how do we then work, like, thoughtfully, carefully, and with humility? I want to add frankness. I want to add humility to frankness, because when we launched the Center for Restorative History in the pandemic, it combined the principles of restorative justice with the tools of public history. And the first object we brought into the collection as part of that was we sat with, sometimes on Zoom, sometimes in person, mostly in the end on telephones with the community in Sumner, Mississippi and Tallahatchie County to bring into the museum the second sign on the site of the river, part of the Tallahatchie River where young Emmett Till's body was retrieved. And the sign that's now on display in the museum has 217 bullet holes in it, or bullet strafe marks. And just the way in which you work with a community, every single word in English and in Spanish on the interpretation of that sign was done with the community in Sumner and broader Tallahatchie County. You can imagine it drove my editors a bit nuts in a really good, uncomfortable way. They weren't used to having anyone to send these labels to a community for them to okay and review and approve. It was such a welcome, though, I think, disruption of the way in which we understand our work and the way in which we understand what it truly means to be with a community, not to a community. You know, we're not of it, we don't live there, but how do you actually sit with a community? So we think a lot about that. Yeah.
Anthea, I must commend you and your team because before I started at AAAM, the Emmett Till sign was one of my grantees at the National Park Service.
Oh, that's right.
And the thing that, you know, as you told that story, the first thing that I thought about is how you did that and you were responsible. When I think about how people sometimes come into any community and they're collecting, it's not done responsibly.
No. Oh, we have a lot of sins in that camp, huh?
You said it.
Yes, ma'am.
I was not
Yes,
going
ma'am.
to.
Oh, yeah.
But,
Absolutely.
But, you know, it's not done responsibly. And I think that all of us have a responsibility now to make sure and to hold, you know, the field to the fire, basically, to ask to make sure that things are done the correct way. Yeah. Even if you have to go back in time, so to speak. Over here in AAAM land, we have maybe over the past 20 years, I've been seeing a trend of plantation homes coming into our membership. And when it first started, you know, there was like a visceral reaction, like, oh my gosh, what in the world do they really want over here? But when you think about it, there's descendant communities on those plantations. And the folks who are at the helm of those plantations want to do things the right way. They want to make sure that as they are engaging the community, that they're having conversations with the descendant communities correctly. They want to make sure they're doing those stakeholder meetings correctly. And that's why we open our doors to the plantation homes at AAAM. Now, if you're asking us to help you host your weddings, we're not going to do that. But we will help you with, you know, your stakeholders meetings and to have real conversations about how to make sure that even if your wall text wasn't correctly done, or wasn't made for everybody, we can go back and make sure that it's done correctly. So to basically encompass everybody. So when I think of how to extend community, that's what I think of. I think of how we all, as a field, can make sure that things are done the right way and ethically, because we don't want anybody to come back to us 50 years from now. I always want to be on the right side of history. I don't know about you guys, but I always do. You know, I was an A+ student and I have an A+ blood type. You know, I'm just trying to stay right there. But, you know, I just want us to do the right thing. And I think that collectively we can do that.
That's great, Geri. You know, maybe Geri, yeah. And maybe
Geri,
just some thoughts on kind of how you've seen communities change, or community involvement or engagement, or community needs, because you have a really different perch than we do.
Well, you know, I was thinking of this for the questions for today, and, you know, I grew up as a child of immigrants in the Bronx, and I didn't go to a museum until I was probably an adult. because it was not seen as something that working class people did, or you'd never get the opportunity. And I think one of the good things that came out of COVID was the ability to visit any museum, through the internet and be able to go on and see collections and different things. And children like me or others could get that opportunity even if you don't live here. I think the one thing from philanthropy that I think we have left out a lot is rural communities. And I think that's something that we're trying to address through some of the new programs. But, there are a lot of hurt people out there, and there are people of color too. I mean, people assume that if you're in rural, you're white. But if the Black Belt, immigrants are settling there now more and more. And there's like the ability to try to figure out. In fact, there's a story today about, I think in Pennsylvania, people losing population to such a point they can't even keep open some of their institutions, so they need more people to move. And I think we have to have that conversation about why is that rural communities have been left out for so long, and why do they feel that they're not seen, right? And I think that's something that museums can certainly do. There's beautiful art, Appalachia, and some of the museums that are, there. But anyway, so I think that's one thing that is trying to look ourselves at where we haven't been making grants, for example, or making investments, and how do we try to do a better job.
That's beautiful.
Thank you. That's fascinating stuff. I want to poke for a second, though.
Sure.
And as a sociologist, social theorist, when I hear community, my hair starts to stand on end. And that's one of the oldest distinctions in my field is Gemeinschaft versus Gesellschaft, or community versus society. And communities are things that are typically understood to be held together by similarity, whereas societies are the things that we share across difference. And particularly when we start to use community in vague ways, it makes me worried. As a democratic person as opposed to a museum person. But nonetheless, it's something that worries me. And so I wanted to, there was this conversation about responsibility, about doing it the right way. I'm interested in what we think about responsibility to whom and why. And if there are ways to serve, maybe the easy way to think about it is to serve multiple communities that may not actually even commensurate with one another. They may not actually have the tools yet, at least, to engage with one another. And I think the rural discussion is a really important one. But so is the question of, Anthea, you mentioned sending the tags back to the community. And my immediate question was, what's who? There are people. I don't mean literally, technically, but there's not. People don't wear name tags that say I'm in this community or that community.
Yeah, in this case they did. There was the Emmett Till Commission that was super specific.
I believe that's I'm not suggesting you did anything wrong, but rather that we imagine this thing, right, which is some kind of a collectivity whose job is who is invested with responsibility, and that to do it the right way is to be in engagement with this imagined unified thing. And I'm, just as we move into this sort of next set of discussions, whom does that leave out? And what kinds of assumptions are we making, or should we try to at least make explicit about what kinds of communities or what kinds of people in society, in Gesellschaft, end up seeming outside and therefore not served as much.
Can I take a shot?
Please.
I think that it's hard not to leave people out because sometimes you don't know who they are, right? But when I was growing up, I think communities changed so much in a way because of stratification, and we would grow up, there were the shopkeepers who owned the shop, lived in the same neighborhood as we did, and we knew the doctor made phone, it's going to age me very much, but the doctor actually made house calls, he lived in the neighborhood it's gotten romanticized, but every mother could discipline every kid. It was not seen as anything outrageous, and I just think we've lost that because of the way the dispersion of people have gone to suburbs and other places, and And it's not that it was deliberate, but maybe sometimes it was, but sometimes it was just like we've lost that sense of a diversity in the community that was really what community was. Like, you weren't resentful. At least I don't remember people being as resentful of richer people, because the assumption was that, you could get there, and therefore it was sort of a opportunity ladders and stuff. But I think I think it's changed so much over the decades that it's very hard now to say what really is the actual community. And is it social, on the social media? Is that a community? I would not suggest that, but
the Surgeon General just told us not to.
I know.
Well, you have a lot. You have two generations. You have two generations where that is their primary social context.
Right.
And so you can. Whatever your value system is around it, there is another lived paradigm that is the present and the future leadership of every community, geographic, social, emotional, identity community, where that is their primary social engagement strata. So again, this notion, Andy, about who is left in and left out, like we have to, and I'm saying this very, with a lot of emotion and force, because I think one of the, to your very good probing, practices, values professionally in this museum context, I think as humans we have to also, but in this museum context, is constantly challenging the value of expertise and how that shapes power dynamics. So I think part of the question you're asking, I hear it as, what groups of people are we willing to share power with, and which ones are we less comfortable sharing power with? And I think that there are, depending on your institution or your own personal experience, or your investors, I'm not going to say board members, I'm going to say investors, because they are investors, they are funders. We can have a conversation also about, there is actually uniqueness of the museum field in the global world. No other cultural ecosystem functions the way the American one does economically. So you all have investors that you're answerable to. And those forces also shape who you feel allowed or not to be in community with. So, I think, though, coming back to the insider point of view, is that our practice of expertise, because there is so much study and scholarship that drives museum work and the core of museum work, that that expertise and where we're willing to let go of expertise also helps to shape who is and isn't in communities that we're willing to consider being in community with. As I think rural is one of them. I see from our vantage point that there is an assumption that folks from a more conservative, political, or partisan part of the spectrum are not interested in culture. You are wrong about that. You are wrong about that. And so who we choose to see as a community also, as opposed to individual actors or something else. We are in a very challenging space, but I think a big opportunity space also for broadening our who we're willing to accept as a viable community to be in relationship with or dialogue with.
I think just real quickly, we could go, thank you to my fellow panelists, because we could take this so many different ways, right? But I want to come back quickly to that notion of power and authority sharing and mapping. And I think one of the things that we all have the opportunity and perhaps the responsibility to do is to truly understand how those work together. That we are nuanced thinkers. We can kind of bring that to all of our work. We can understand the ways in which people have been uplifted and the ways in which they've been excluded, right? And we can understand that and weave that in, I think, to our work. And our I shudder too, because it's an ongoing debate, as my colleagues will tell you, for the Smithsonian. Well, we serve everyone. Well, what does that mean? Mm-hmm. And how does that actually work then programmatically, which is hugely challenging? And again, we come back to that difference between audience and community. And I think the tighter you can understand your audience goals and your audience outreach, that to then align with your mission, to really bring yourself into your own internal alignment, as well as then your place-based alignment. And we have a lot of people here, and looking at Omar, who understand deeply the power of those places as historic sites, as places of memory, as places of harm, as places of opportunity, and really as places of education. That I do think that we, the more kind of we understand of how all those things work together in our specific places in which we work, I think the better we're going to be, which is why I think the interdisciplinary work, and kudos to having a sociologist. We don't get to hang with them much as historians because, we've got these old, and using German is so perfect, by the way. No, I'm serious. That's who we are. We were trained, we are in an 1880s mindset of I'm a historian and you're a sociologist, right? And that's how kind of we're trained. But I think we have such a responsibility to ourselves to understand how our professions, however we were trained, how those are rooted in their time, so that we can then kind of unroot them, I think, and learn from them and weave them together in our time in a blanket that is, in a tapestry that is understandably contextual, but ideally can also be even radically inclusive.
Oh, sorry, I was taking notes. But also, I was trying to figure out how I was going to answer your question, because in AAAM land, we accept everybody. But also our members have, I shouldn't say half. The mission of the African American Museum is to make sure that we are telling the truth and nothing but the truth. And I haven't been to one of our museums where they have kind of shied away from it. I think maybe just recently, if through federal sources or something, they weren't able to say it. If they were a federal organization or a state or local organization where they got a mandate that you could not say this because it was in a banned book. That may have been something, right? But but then the community would get together and tell legislators and congressmen that this is not going to work for us because we are part of that museum. Our museums double up as also places of space. So it's not just the museum, but it's also have your baby shower here, get married at our museum, have your community meeting here. And I'm sure if my members could have their way, vote here.
Yes.
But, schools have that, public schools have that on lock. We're not trying to mess that up.
Not in California.
Not in California.
California, you
Not
can,
everywhere.
big states, you can actually vote in someone's garage.
you can.
So you can anywhere, right? I mean, I find that kind of strange myself as growing up in a place where you voted in a public school, but in places where there's huge populations, they need different spaces. And you can be in a parking garage or a parking lot or a museum.
You know what, to your point, I live in a rural area in Maryland, in Baltimore County, right next to Sykesville. If anybody ever wants to come visit me, I will not open my door, but please come. But
She'll wave to you from the
I'll
porch.
wave to you from the porch. But in all honesty, we vote at the church because there is no local school. So thank you, Geri, for making me think about that. But yeah, so I think about those things, like what are the external things, to your question, Andy, what are the external things that make us not have to tell the truth? And it's usually surrounded around funding.
Right.
And more so not the private funders, and not the foundations, because my members tend to be really scrappy and they, for a long time, have not had money and funders come to them. But it's if they are getting federal or state funding, what are they being told that they're not allowed to say? And again, it's the community petitions, running up on the Hill. I would not recommend it because everybody loves their freedom, but try to figure out how to do that legally. But running up on the Hill and like having a conversation with your congressman about what is not something that you're willing to accept. And then that usually changes it. But that's about it. Because our rural museums have the same ideologies of even our bigger museums. So that wouldn't be like a count out. It's more so accessibility.
There's a number of, this is on the same question, not move into a different question yet, but a number of you have mentioned words like context. Vedet, you just said the truth and nothing but the truth, but you didn't say the whole truth, which is like the other thing in that list.
I thought it was implied.
Well,
but
it
yes,
is,
we tell the whole truth.
But I want to, again, I'm poking here from a social theory kind of standpoint. But I'm reminded of Borges's fable of the map. Y'all know this fable. Okay, so the king of a territory brings his favorite best map maker and he says, I want a perfect map of my territory. And I want this map to include every feature and to fully represent my entire territory. And as king, I really, I deserve this. And so the map maker goes away and develops a map that's, usable and is quite detailed. And the king says, but this feature's not there, and this feature's not there, and this feature's not there. The map maker goes away, makes a bigger map and a stronger map. King is still dissatisfied because there are features of the territory that are not there. And of course, the implication ultimately is that the perfect map is the whole territory. And therefore, it's useless, right? So in the question of when we say we want perfect context, the context is the whole, it's everything. You're no longer doing anything if the whole context is there. In fact, I'm going to say, if you're telling the whole truth, you're actually not you're not interpreting. You're not doing the difficult work that I was suggesting needs to be part of this. And so I guess I wanted to partly pick up on Laura's point about our conservative people, the community that is most left out, either by implication or explicitly, and also to ask, what are the right ways to think about where context stops or how interpretation or argument works in this problematic framework?
Where context stops.
I might pick up something about context briefly, is going back to that notion of expertise and even education, sort of flipping and going to the evidence and stories that we have from the general public around studies, folks who regularly and don't regularly go to museums, about those that go, why they go, and those that don't go, why they still think museums are important. And they are emotive reasons, they are about the feeling that you get when you go about yourself. When you go, it's almost never about what's actually on the walls or in the place. Everything is a prompt for myself. It makes me feel full, happy, curious. So I think about, Andy, you talked about, or was it both you and Lisa, that the follow-up, when you're learning, that in some ways museums are places when they are at their best. They inspire individual follow-up, not necessarily acquisition of facts. And so I think about that. That's the first in your question about what's the perfect story, and the whole truth is maybe about inspiring people and giving them tools or directionality to explore the whole truth for themselves. Because you've just pointed out an axle that we get twisted around a lot in interpretation. How much is too much? But I'll just start there.
Sure.
Well, historians believe that context, it never stops. But But I want to pick on something that Laura said in terms of the work that I think we're all committed to make sure that those who experience both in our walls and experience us online see themselves reflected in our work and the stories we tell, the objects we share, the interpretation we bring forth, and the education we provide. And so I think that that is hugely significant to your point, really about agency. Do we help people understand their own agency? And do we give them tools of critical reading, critical analysis to help? We haven't really touched on misinformation and disinformation, but it is, by the way, it is as old as humanity. 100%. You know, if you have Matthew Brady gruesomely moving bodies around on Civil War battlefields to take the pictures that he wants to take to tell the stories that he wants to tell about the Civil War, you know that we're rooted, right, in the capacity to manipulate. And so giving people an understanding, especially Laura, to your point, that Gen Z and Gen Alpha, it is what they know, it is what they're agile in. It is that world of a kind of swirl of digital access and digital media and access to information that, you know, when I tell my sons that we had to go to the library, you know, to get a book out to read about, you know, I'm just overjoyed, actually. I cannot imagine living my life without that access to information. What I can imagine, though, and what we see all the time, I think, is the ways in which that's manipulated. And I think the spaces in that we then can provide, and then the tools that we can provide individuals and families and the communities in which they're rooted, to be more specific, I think are just essential. And then I know a number of you are in the Made by Us coalition, right, which is now, I don't know, 500, 400 strong, of really thinking about 2026, thinking about what is modern day civics, and really thinking about Gen Z engagement. And on that website, there's inordinate data that they've collected about who Gen Z is and how they see themselves in this world. And it's fantastic and really rich, I think, for all museum professionals, you know, to understand and to really work with.
Laura, I thought that, you know, since IMLS is always collecting data, you were going to talk about AAM's study that said that museums are the most trusted, right? And when I think about that, I think about the fact that people aren't even going to their friends anymore because they're not trusted. They're not trusted, and everybody is so polarized that they might as well just go to a museum and learn. And I'm all for that because I feel that, you know, I can go to Anthea's museum and, you know, I think you guys have probably taken it down by now, but I remember when I first came to DC for school at Howard University, if there's any Bisons. Oh, thank you.
I'm not, but I wish I were.
We'll take it, Anthea. But when I first came and I walked into American history and I saw the KKK costume, and I just remember I was like, I don't have any business being in DC. I need to go back to Jersey because I've never seen anything like it. Scared the crap out of me. But at the same time, I had a real honest conversation afterwards at Howard where we spoke about it with my grandfather, where we spoke about the KKK, with my mom, who didn't have any, she didn't have any, you know, her own experience with the KKK, but my great-great-grandfather did. And those were the conversations, and that was the learning that we had. And then obviously she told me to pull out the Encyclopedia Britannica, and it was not in there, but, you know, it was just things like that. And then I think about my son, who's 10, and the other day I said, on Juneteenth of all days, he said, what why is Juneteenth so important? And as both of my eyes were twitching, he said, I pranked you. And I said, okay, because that's not going to work for mommy. But right at that moment, I threw his behind in the car and we drove around Baltimore County. We went to a safe house for the Underground Railroad. And then we also went to a home. Well, it turned into a museum, but it was a home that also turned into a church where enslaved people who worked the quarries went to that church, and they lived all up and down the road. And as we got out of the car, I said, you're going to get out of this car. You're going to learn all about this museum. And he's looking at me like, oh, my gosh. But then we had a conversation. And he said, I would have loved to do this at home on my VR. Right. You know, and I'm like, what are you? I would have loved to do this on my goggles. And I'm like, okay, let me go get a grant from IMLS to figure that one out. But that's what they want to do. That's how they want to learn. And if the accessibility piece is there for another conversation, then by all means. I think that's where, you know, the written wall text, that context ends. And then we need to continue the conversation to reach the new generations, because that's what they want. And they also want to engage and say crazy things on Facebook. And I'm fine with that too, because I can get a little crazy at times as well. But I like the engagement. I like the firsthand, real-time engagement with folks who are saying, you know, I love that museum because of this. Mm-hmm. I did not like this experience, but I love this museum. Yeah. And those are the things.
Yeah. And you're brilliantly also weaving in technology, you know, kind of versus, I think we think right to social media, which is of course essential and part of our world. But I think a lot of us are thinking about technology in ways that are really dynamic and accessible and inclusive. In ways that we perhaps didn't have either the will or just the true technological advancements and innovations to engage.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm all for technology and for the ability to use social media especially. I do worry about the fact that there's no kind of filter. And, you know, especially in elections, for example, it's very hard to recruit poll workers anymore because they're all being doxxed and threatened. Sure. I know enough election administrators now that on both all across the political spectrum, who have gotten unbelievably awful threats to them, not just themselves, but to their families and their children. And you know, I don't know what you do about that. I mean, it used to be free speech was that you could just say what you want as long as you didn't cry fire in a theater, right? Because that would be seen as taking it too far. And that, I'm not sure there's even those restrictions anymore. Yeah, nobody is really held accountable. Right. And a lot of times they're bots or they're not using their correct names. I remember E.J. Dionne once said that, he said he gets like 20 death threats a day or something. It was a while ago, and he was talking to me, and he said, and I was like, huh? And he goes, well, it used to be you'd have to write a letter to me, and you'd have to walk to the post office and put a stamp on it. And by the time you did all that, you literally weren't as angry anymore. And now it is, you just go on, you see my handle, and you send me a wicked, you know, angry, you know, spleen-breaking, a message. And I do think that I wonder about that, and I wonder how we all kind of, you can't put the genie back in the bottle, but is there ways to really hold people accountable for the kind of things that they stir up, you know, from a secret place?
Yeah. Well, the First Amendment still exists, so that's essential. But I think your point about accountability, and then what is essential as well, and what has been unleashed, I think, is what we're dealing with, right? That being allowed or called to be our worst selves instead of our best selves. And that is that's something I think we see on the ground every day in our spaces. And how I was in the museum last week, and I heard this presumably mother say, I think she was chaperoning, so I'm thinking one of the children was her. She's like, whatever happened to your museum manners? And you know what I mean, right? Like it's like church manners, right? Yeah. You know, but that's also part of that kind of also sense of these are privileged spaces, these may or may not be for you. So that's kind of on that side. But I do think that what we have to deal with this, especially, we collect every election at the American History Museum. Hey, Tricia Edward, I didn't know you were here. Oh, Sites and Affiliations, I want to give him a shout out. How are you? But, thinking about then collecting this election cycle and what do you bring in and how, again, do you document, and just looking at the last set of election cycles, and that's the other thing I think that responsibility of museums has to really, be in there and document we're in the grist mill of history, so we have to document, even sometimes we feel like grist, ground down, but we need to document the mill equipment and the grist at the same time. And I think that's an undying responsibility that we have. To our work, right? And to our callings, and to be in service. I think so.
And just one thing to add to, Andy and I were talking before the panel started, and how do we actually train people or have people learn about debating and not being angry all the time? I mean, there's a reason not. I mean, you can have a conversation at a bar or something over, and I have had many, in many bars, about immigration, and you can get people to understand some of the complexities of it. But it's not easy, and you might not get everybody, but you get people to understand why the system is so broken. But I think that's the kind of thing we don't have this time or the space for, the personal connections and the ability to have this, or frankly, the ability to feel you can have it.
Yeah, there was something interesting, Andy, that you said around the practice of argument, and I will say that I had a very visceral reaction to that. As I was listening, what I heard more you telling us was, in my mind, sounds more like dialogue. And I also think about different cultural practices, and even the concepts of debate and these forms come from very specific cultural histories. And there are many, many other cultural practices around talking to each other. And as we're in, and I love this, democracy is doing, I think it's really important. And for the museum world, I think in this larger conversation, and I will say that we have museums as site of folks enacting their opinions with defacing of art and buildings, attacks on museum leaders personally, and then holding the dialogue inside museums. And these are museums of all types around all topics that we're surrounded by a binary that asks us to figure out how to choose the right side. And I really love that you opened space for just exchange of information in that way. And again, going back to curiosity and inspiration and why people come to museums, they actually don't come right to be told, or libraries even, right? They're not, a librarian doesn't tell them which book they need that day.
Exactly.
You get to ask, you get to say, I have an idea, or I'm interested, and you get to explore. So I was thinking about that, and as we're negotiating rightness and debate and how we're interacting with each other, what are the norms that we're pulling from to engage. And I think that the museum field is actually designing new ways. And maybe we don't give ourselves enough, you don't give yourselves enough credit for being in the design phase of things.
Especially around debate, which is highly structured and highly contextual and generally highly white.
We're about to open it up for questions from the audience. I just wanted, first of all, to thank you all. This has been a tremendous discussion, and I've learned a tremendous amount from the conversation thus far. Laura, the reason I don't just stick with dialogue is that I think people often people feel that when the stakes are lowered too much, the conversation isn't important anymore. And so the reason I prefer argument or debate is because it includes the possibility you might actually persuade someone else that you're right. And so, I don't know, people like us that are kind of intellectual-ish like the idea of just talking about stuff, but folks who are really committed to a position may want the opportunity to try to prove that they're right. And I think that's valid and appropriate, which is why I tend to go with that. I do also think, in one of the things that Geri said before is really important, we live in a time in this country, certainly, of much greater inequality and much more durable inequality, like much less social mobility across generation. And one of the effects of that for democratic discourse is that every conversation is existential, right? Yeah. Losing a debate could mean catastrophic things for you and your family, and people like you. And it's tough to have a good conversation and respect difference and think with the other person's argument when that is existentially on the line. So I do think there's some really important connections between each of these. Should we open it up for questions and conversation?
Yeah. There's such great people in the room. So.
Hello, everyone. Omar Eaton Martinez, Senior Vice President for the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and the one Vedet keeps on referring to as her chair here. I'm the chair.
Come clean, Omar.
I had to come clean. I tried to be anonymous, but. So when you talk about identity and community, I found it really powerful because part of it is understanding community also is using the now analytical framework of intersectionality, right? Because sometimes we start talking about community and then we start naming, we got to name them now, okay? But when we start naming them, even those names are problematic in some cases, or very limiting. And so thinking about how do we build better language, better conversation, better discussion to acknowledge all the complexities of our personhood and all the complexities of our humanity, right? I love what you said, Andy, around debate with the purpose to gain understanding versus conversion.
Yes.
For me, that's what I strive for at the work that I do, is try to create safe and brave spaces for people to see the humanity in one another. And they can't do that if I'm trying to convert you. We're trying to win, it doesn't work. I have a 20-year-old daughter, poli-sci major, wants to go to law school, wants to be the next president of the United States as soon as she's old enough, right? But I try to teach her, because she's a trained debater, and I try to teach her, like, I understand what you're doing with debate, but you can't shame people into it. She's very good at arguing. I know. I know this, right? But you can't shame people that way. So I also wanted to kind of offer into the conversation the idea of query-based engagement, having people challenge their assumptions through, strategic questions rather than me just outlining my argument better than you align yours. And then lastly, the one thing I didn't hear around technologies were the two letters AI.
Yeah. We didn't really talk much about inquiry-based knowledge, but I think all of us and inquiry-based learning, I mean, that's, I think been I think museums have done that really well. For me, it's like kind of what's next, the probing and the questioning, and then making sure we're giving people the space and the tools and the materiality to help, to kind of help answer those, which I think is really essential. Yeah. I'd love to talk about AI.
Good morning, everyone. Ed Tephorn. I'm the executive director for the Angel Island Immigration Station Foundation. Just wanted
in San Francisco, California.
In San Francisco, California. Thank you so much for your perspectives and your wisdom. One of the questions was who gets left out, and I just wanted to add to the conversation that two groups who often get left out are indigenous communities as well as Asian American, Native Hawaiian Pacific Islanders. For the latter, often in majority conversations, we're not seen as being large enough to matter. And then even in social justice spaces, we're seen as being too white often, and so we're invisible on multiple fronts. And as we come together today to talk about museums and democracy, in this context of democracy, I represent a site that is a former US immigration station, but in reality is a former detention center that was built to enforce exclusionary immigration policies, sought to keep specific people out of our countries, and also laws that kept our communities from becoming US citizens. So I hope that as we're talking about democracy, that we're not just talking about citizenship, but also this thought, this notion of who gets to live here, who matters, and can we all live in a future space where regardless of where you were born, what language you speak, how you identify, that we collectively feel like we all feel safe and that we all belong. Thank you.
Thank you.
On that note, can I just say, since I was going to plug this anyway, and with you all, one of the museums that we work closely with in New York is the Lower East Side Tenement Museum, which is, if you've never been there, it's a fantastic opportunity. But we also have, there's a huge network of ethnic museums, as you've alluded to, and they're great. But there are opportunities also to talk about immigration, because most people just assume everybody came the right way, and that's actually not true, regardless of when you came. And so it's a crazy structure that's been around for centuries. But we do a campaign every year called basically Great Immigrants, Great Americans, which is based on naturalized Americans. We put them in an ad in the New York Times on July 4th. And we really want people to start to think about the conversation. So we have actually now decided to do comic series. And they're available now if you want to see. There's 5 of them. And this one is actually on Betty Quan Chin, who basically swam from China to Hong Kong in order to escape, and then came to the U.S. and is a naturalized citizen now, and she lives in Eureka, California, and has donated 9 million meals over her time to feed the homeless and people who are unable to get food. But we hope that these kinds of conversations can help, and maybe through your institutions and others, for people to hear another side of it. So I appreciate you raising that, and a lot of people don't know about their own immigration routes, never mind who's coming today. Thank you.
Question for you, Andrew. Really enjoyed your presentation. I was thinking about your parting thoughts. And one of your bullet points was that all people deserve safety. And in my experience, increasingly so, for many, safety can mean not even hearing counterpoints, because when they do, they're uncomfortable and thus no longer in a safe environment. And so I'd just love for you to dig into that word choice versus something like respect.
Interesting. Well, so the phrase that the phrase is all people deserve safety, no ideas do. I would agree that all people deserve respect, of course. So it's not just physical safety that all people deserve, and sort of a foundational thing. But I think, and I'm straightforwardly importing this from my work on higher ed curricula, which is the world I spend most of my time in as well. But I do think that the distinction between safety and comfort has been elided too much, and that education and learning are very difficult when comfort is the main standard. So respect for person is straightforwardly something everyone deserves. That's part of the civility argument. But frankness can sometimes overwhelm that, I think, as a standard. But I don't think any idea deserves safety. And that includes ideas that we find really cherished, right? And to me, that's actually a respect point as well, that one of the things that we do to respect ideas and the people who hold them is to submit them to rigorous challenge, evidentiary debate, consideration of their implications, and that can be uncomfortable. It ought to be uncomfortable. But again, I think if we think about what the line is, certainly the line stops well before the literal safety of the people involved. And I think it ought to stop before before we undermine the respect for those persons as well. Does that work?
Good morning, and thank you again for all your insightful remarks. My name is Devin Ackman. I'm currently the director of the Michigan State University Museum, and I appreciate your thoughts about physical safety and ideas working on a college campus as well. Mm-hmm. I'm conflicted, having run the Arab American National Museum, and some of the complexities, thank you, in the past with trying to shelter certain conversations. So I can see the complexities there. But something that really resonates so much, I mean, like a torrent of thoughts. You talked about being caffeinated with that as an audience member out here. But I'm really struck in particular about, so yes, we need more dialogue virtually in our civic space. But one of the things that I think you've illuminated on, and I'm still trying to grapple with in real time, is like everything feels existential right now. The changing demographic, climate, on and on and on, our democracy, right? And what I still struggle with my staffs, current and past, was how do we become better facilitators of this dialogue? Sure, we can do things didactically, we can do the wonderful things working with community, but it's through the conversation. And oftentimes that happens in our physical spaces or virtually. And this is the huge question mark in my I would love to hear some thoughts. I know we're not going to solve that, but just if you have any thoughts, anyone has any thoughts on how to become better facilitators of this complex dialogue within the spaces that we're trying to make fertile grounds for that dialogue.
Sure. That's a great question. You said Michigan State, right? Yes. Your new president is my friend. Please say hi to Kevin. Look, I think actually the existential character of debate is not actually new, although it's very, very present at the moment. I remember coming of age during the nuclear freeze controversies and the movie The Day After, which was, specifically, there was a wonderful old article called Scared Stiff or Scared into Action, which was just about the extent to which that existential fear, is it motivating or is it simply debilitating? I think it's unwise to try to act as if the threats are not existential. There are existential threats, but most of the time humanity actually survives those existential threats, and so having the debates in ways that preserve. I think the balance to me is about preserving the importance, right? So I was saying to Geri before, I have a colleague who makes the big debate in his class, is a hot dog a sandwich? And we can talk civilly about whether a hot dog is a sandwich, but that doesn't really show whether we can talk civilly about, the existential character of our planet. So I think the right balance is to try to recognize that these debates are super important and the stakes are really high, but that they're not so high that we can't brook the possibility that we're wrong, this humility point, and that we can actually learn from people who see them really differently.
Yeah. I think facilitation is key, and thank you, Devin, for that question and for all of your great work in the field. And the way in which, of course, facilitation then, I think, demands a lot of what we've been talking about: care, accountability, right, deep preparation, and especially as we do museum education, which is a lot of where our active facilitation comes in. Not all of it, but a lot of it. I think we've all learned how important it is to make sure that our staff and our colleagues feel that they are both empowered and emboldened, but also kept safe. I think that's gotten that terrain's gotten even more challenging. But also then to Laura's point, to check our own, we didn't get to biases, but was one of your pre-questions for us, to really examine our own biases first to see, how are we coming into these conversations? What do we need to leave at our doors, in our box? I love the metaphor of a box. Like, okay, check your ego, you can check a lot of things in that box. And then to truly understand the audience to which you're addressing, and to be incredibly smart about, I think, that pre-work that we need to do to understand as much as possible about our audience. We're going to speak differently to school groups who are going to be in our museum for 45 minutes than we are to teachers who we're in an intense relationship with over years on how best to teach American history in ways in which their students will accept it. So I think the more we can move, though, to up on the balcony facilitation and see our spaces as facilitating discourse, debate, and whether we can't necessarily let people vote at the National Museum of American History as a polling place, but we certainly can hold a lot of voter registration like we did on Saturday for summer solstice, where we had a big reggaeton dance party and had 7,000 people come to the museum after 5:30 at night. And I haven't gotten the numbers on how many people registered to vote, but it was a core part of what we were doing. And so that, to me, I think is really exciting to think about what we can facilitate, kind of uppercase F and then lowercase f.
They can work on DC voting, DC voting rights.
Well, I also think about Devin with the Arab American National Museum and the difference in facilitation, and Vedet knows that I'm serving it up to her, because I think in the diversity of our field, first voice institutions have something to say.
Yeah.
Yes, we have a lot to say. Devin, when you asked your question, the first thing that I thought about was, I feel that we as a field writ large have the upper hand for facilitation and having really hard conversations because people want them and they want them with us. And then we can point them in the direction of the artifact or, the history. I think about the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum. Has anybody been? Well, if you're in AAAM land, you've gone, so please raise your hand and please do not embarrass me on this Good Monday. But the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum is actually two museums. It's the Mississippi State Historical Society Museum. I always say State Historical Society. And then it's the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum. And when you walk in, you have no choice but to face the civil rights side. But you can make a decision. Right. It's like, fork in the road, which way are you going to go? I always go to the civil rights side first. And that's not because of how I look. I want to learn all of the things about how America is and how we see one another and the things that African Americans went through, because it's not just our story, it's an American story, but we aren't the only ones who went through something like that. It may have been one of the hardest histories and the hardest things in American history, one of them. Please note that I'm saying one and not the, because I don't want anybody to bash me on Twitter or tell anybody that I'm out here not saying the right thing about history, or take any of my degrees away because they were all expensive. So I'm going to keep them. But I remember walking through that museum, getting back to what I was talking about, Devin. I remember walking through that museum and I heard they have a little enclave. You walk in, it's really dark, and there's names of individuals who have been lynched. And there was a white gentleman in there that was sobbing. And I was very uncomfortable because I knew what that meant. That meant that as soon as he saw me, he was going to turn around and say, "I am so sorry." And that's exactly what happened. And he said, "I'm just so sorry. I'm so sorry." And I said, "Sir, it's okay. It's okay, but I'm not going to cry with you because I don't have any Kleenex and all the things. I didn't want my mascara to run." But he said, "I am sorry because not only am I a part of history as being a white man and watching these atrocities happen and not being able to stop, but my grandfather was in the KKK." And I, again, thought about the National Museum of American History when I saw that robe. And it's like a robe literally descended from the sky and started falling on him. And he was like, but I'm not in the KKK. And I said, thank you, sir. So we continued to have a conversation, but there was reconciliation that happened there. We walked out of there kind of like arm in arm because I had to hold him up because he was literally broken down. And I just said, sir, this is a place for us to learn this. Mm-hmm. This is a place for us to continue to have dialogue. This is a place for you to go back and change the trajectory of your lineage, because your kids and your grandkids and grandkids after that and great-great-grands and all the ancestors, you're going to become an ancestor one day. And you want to be able to have everybody 5 generations after you know what happened, but also know how to reconcile it. So I think that those are the types of conversations that we can have in our space. And you are actually in the right space because we're all on indigenous land, but you're so close to Saginaw. So look at me solving your problems.
Can I also say something about space really quickly? Yeah. Okay, I'll shut up.
Yep.
Thank you. Jim Hurd, I'm the director of the Daniel K. Inouye National Center for the Preservation of Democracy at the Japanese American National Museum in Los Angeles. Have I used up all my time? Or Jim from the Democracy Center for short. Thank you to Edward, who brought up the issue of Asian Americans feeling invisible at times. And I think it talks to community and to what Omar was talking about, intersectionality, and what we're facing as a culturally specific institution. I took the role almost 2 years ago, and I had a moment where I thought, how do I feel about working at a Japanese American institution, not being Japanese, being mixed race Filipino American? And thankfully, we have a wonderful president and CEO who I've known for years, who I've admired, and I know what the work that she wanted to do and what we want to do at the Democracy Center in terms of a multicultural, multiracial democracy. But there was this moment for me when I first started where I asked some friends, hey, I'm at JANM now, why don't you guys come over? And they actually told me, are we allowed to go there?
Yeah.
And I had thought for a moment, well, why wouldn't you?
Yeah.
So how can culture, and there's some internal politics as well, how can culturally specific institutions maintain that sense of who they are, who they've been, their story, but also open the doors for everyone else to come in? Because I don't see the history of what happened to Japanese Americans during World War II, the fight for reparations and redress, as a Japanese American story. I see it as an American story. Right. But how do we get that to be normalized within communities?
Oh, I guess everybody's looking at, I'll do it. First, open houses, I think, are a really good thing. Doing programming that is, let's sit down and have fireside chats are amazing. Oh, I love them. I also love rapid response conversations. So, if there is something else that I love, and I don't know about every academic if they would agree with this, but I love watching like the History Channel or National Geographic or Amazon Prime and seeing what documentary is there and then offering them into the space. Like, let's have a conversation. Let's all watch it together in your respective homes, and then let's have a conversation, or come to the museum and have a conversation. You should also really think about having your immigrations, what is it called? Naturalization ceremonies at your space, and inviting the community, inviting everyone, not just your the Asian Pacific community, but everybody that's involved, because to me, that there's nothing more American than having a naturalization ceremony in your space. So something like that, I feel, would also help open their eyes. And I can tell you, there are several people who say, "Am I allowed to go into the African American Museum?" And I'm like, if you don't hurry up and get in there, go, so you can learn it all, right? So, but your story isn't it's not just you. Same thing happened at American Indian. So definitely, please have a conversation with them as well. Any cultural specific organization. I remember with Cajun, are you allowed to go? It's not a synagogue. You can go in, and I think you're allowed to go in a synagogue even if you're not Jewish. So I think it's fine. You just have to, open up the dialogue for it.
That's a good point.
Yeah. How are we doing on time?
We have. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
We have a question from Laptop Land.
Oh.
We have about 40 people logged in,
Great.
all over everywhere. And Woody has a question that is very long, but I am going to use my best museum skills. And he is thinking about, what do you do when you've got people who visit your museum and they think about it that day and then they don't think about it again? How do you try to ride the news cycle if it's relevant to your content? And then I think after that we'll take Melissa's question and then sorry, Melissa.
So it's two questions. It's how do you continue engagement, and then how do you kind of also make your
Relevant.
very contemporary relevance. Writing the news cycle.
Why?
To bring people into the museum.
Yeah. I mean, I would just say why. This is just from sustainable business practice also. I would go back to my old land as the head of an association, a museum association. The question is always why. Just like any good program design. Why? What are you going to do that is going to strengthen what you do as a museum? Is it to bring people in? Mm-hmm. Okay, well then, that's a social media push. Hey, y'all want to learn more about what was just on, XYZ newscast? We've got stuff about it. That's an of the moment marketing campaign. Again, but with what do you do for the person who comes in and comes out? The same thing that teachers do with students who don't care about English but really care about math.
That's right.
Or you do your best. We can't control what people do. We can do our best to give them a meal that was tasty and satisfying, I think. Museums can't do everything, but you can do what you do from where you sit with the tools you've got.
Well, I think especially with the tools of continued digital engagement, making sure that people feel comfortable. First, and it's all going to be an opt-in. Of course, if they feel comfortable giving you your email, structuring, using our constituent resource management tools or whatever one you use, whether it be Tessitura or Salesforce or et cetera, popular in the museum spaces, but to really then create those ongoing opportunities, I think, is essential. It's challenging for us on the national scene because you don't, especially at American History, you don't have to have a reservation. You don't have to get a pass. You could come in every week, and if you didn't see the same docent or the same visitor services person, we might not know. So we have a different set of challenges. But I think in general, building that continuous engagement, which we've all tried so hard to do the last 10, 15, 20 years, but to keep them on that journey with you, I think is essential. But I think what you're also saying, Laura, is really important, also to give yourself that grace to say, okay, you have to hope that you've sent them into the world and they're going to have the conversations, maybe even the debates. Like you so beautifully relayed, Vedet, of going home and really talking about what you saw, with your people, with your family, with your loved ones. And it is, as we know, it is kind of one mind and one heart at a time. So.
Now, the good news about today is that we're going to have a lot of time for conversation in the afternoon after lunch. So we're going to take 3 more questions, and then we're going to wrap up. So,
thank you so much, and good morning, everybody. I'm Elena Gonzalez, the curator of civic engagement and social justice from the Chicago History Museum. Mm-hmm. I wanted to connect what Laura was talking about earlier about the modes of communication that may fall, outside of argument, and what Andy was talking about in his presentation earlier about forging collectivity. So my question is, what does it mean to forge collectivity, which I see as being, a key part of civility, and work for social justice, which I think is essential for, health, safety, and well-being, but not seek consensus?
So consensus doesn't mean unanimity. You can have consensus and divergence. That's a type of consensus. And I think to Andy's point earlier, we've got to be careful about totalitarian approaches.
Yeah, thank you.
I'll just.
That's beautifully said.
Yeah, I mean, I think I have a whole set of my own political commitments that are separate from my commitment to democracy. But I think I have a certain amount of faith that if everyone were subjected to a good debate, they would ultimately agree with me. But but I do think that the preservation of difference is a value in and of itself, and so I guess that's how I think about sort of forging a collectivity that maintains and values real disagreement and difference.
Hi everyone, I'm Hanako Akatsuki Jong with the Japanese American Museum of Oregon and the adjunct faculty for Johns Hopkins in the Museum Studies program. So, we talked a lot about community and representation and, for diverse, representation perspectives in the museums. And, when I look around, there's not I'm coming from the lens from culturally specific museums and the BIPOC community, and I don't necessarily see a lot of representation as much as there could be. And I was just wondering, how do we support, or how are your institutions are supporting BIPOC community members to come into this field? Because in one aspect, it's oversaturated with applicants, it's underpaid, but then how do we get more people in to help with the diversity of perspective to help us kind of move forward in telling these diverse stories and being more representative?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah. Diligence. Thoughtfulness.
I saw you moving first.
Well,
I was just going to say economics. We have it's a broken economic industry.
Right.
So funders have a role to play in influencing and requiring good business practices. And that's coming, and that has been coming. So I'll speak for IMLS and then some of our sister agencies like the NEH and the NEA that require certification of paying living wages in all budgets that are submitted for staffing. Funders paying for staffing as long as museums are funded by 60% unearned revenues and only 40% through earned revenues, which is ticketing and rental and fee-based things. 60% are grants or donations.
Right.
So there's a real basic economics to it. You get good diversity where people can get good living wage jobs, and we're not that industry. And so there, I will say, as a funder, and as somebody's an agency that is looking at museums from a policy perspective, there are things that we're mapping to give individual institutions a roadmap, because no one institution is going to fix it for everybody else. So I'll just be really honest that it's also not a moral conversation. I go back to practicalities, that the money isn't right, but we need some money to make that money right.
Correct. Yeah. Since the pandemic, I can just tell you that majority of retention is really hard. Even just in my own office, I've had tons of turnover, and I always look at what's happening in my office as a set stimuli of what's happening in the field. So I literally had a staffer tell me that she was going to leave because she was going to make more money at Uber. So I can't, and she could make up her own hours. And then I had somebody else say, oh, well, I want to be part-time, but I want full-time benefits. And that wasn't how I was set up at the time. But now I am, because I have to be flexible, so those are the things that I think about. It's just, what is our field doing? And then where's the money? Show me the money. I've seen some, but we have to literally advocate a lot more for it.
Yeah, I do think it does. Thank you for all of the economic realities and the realities of the field. So just speaking though to the core, maybe the heart of the question is that the commitment and the diligence that I mentioned in my lightning round approach just has to be continuously there, and you have to wake up every morning and recommit to that, because it is still we're facing the demographics of our field in ways that we see both the peril of that and the promise of that all at once, kind of rolled into our everyday life. So.
Hi, I'm Sarah Jacob from George Washington's Mount Vernon. I'm the Senior Manager of Education Operations. Figure out what I do, because I don't know. One of the things I wanted to just sort of ask is, as one of the people talking today from a mid-level position, not a director position, how are you at your institutions bringing this sort of ideas of museums as a democratic space, not only to the sort of theoretical, our institution does this, but how are you getting it to trickle down? And how are you preparing staff? And what does that day-to-day reality of a democratic museum look like, as opposed to the sort of theoretical out in the ether space?
That's a great question. Yeah. I mean, some of the tactics, Sarah, and nice to see you, neighbor, down the way, have been mentioned, of course, like committing yourself to seeing democracy and the living democracy as a verb, which I know it's not a verb, but really like how do you activate it? How do you animate it? How do you embody it? What it takes to put on a program in any museum, right? It necessarily involves so many people, whether it be security, facilities, educators, program specialists, program producers, one person who's trying to do all of that, depending on your size. But I think having that inculcated into the culture where these types of programs are really important. We're going to make partnerships with those who know it best, whether that be with a nonprofit partner or with naturalization services, or with the huge range. And we're blessed here in this federal landscape where you can actually reach out to fill in the blank agency and say, I want to do a project on the climate crisis with EPA, or with, kind of making sure that you bring in that sense of also support. But I think really kind of inculcating that into the culture of the museum, and then helping people see the power of that. When we do naturalization ceremonies, there's nothing like it, especially we did one with all veterans. So fighting for your country and not being a citizen, or not being allowed to be a citizen of your country, which of course, as we know beautifully from the 442nd and so many different servicemen and women across time, right, who have understood that what the promise of this country was not being met by the current situation of the country. So I think that's a big answer, but I think there's a lot really that we can do to create that that kind of sense of our own internal museum community or historic site community, to see ourselves in that way.
I think there's also a movement, and I hear you from the mid-level piece, and maybe talking also a little bit about internal dynamics.
Yeah.
Okay. So again, talking about what is and then what are the capacities. It's very new that museum studies programs treat management skill and organizational development skill as a thread of training. You're just supposed to be, it's like, you know, you're supposed to just be talented at knowing how to run an organization. It's a science. It's a science, it's a skill set. And so there's more attention to that now. So I think there's a movement, again, to, you know, museums being healthy places because they are also places of work. And you're a workplace. Mm-hmm. And so what does democracy look like? A healthy organization looks like a healthy democracy, right? Where it has healthy, resilient systems that can withstand and invite conversation, dialogue, iteration, and growth. So that's something that IMLS we've seen as a need, heard from the field at multiple levels as a need, and so that's why we reestablished our 21st Century Museum Professionals Grant Program, which had been dormant for more than a decade. Mm-hmm. And it's our workforce intervention program that allows museums to, and it's not the only program, to say we need to spend time on figuring out what our system looks like as a just system, and that comes in various ways. So it's not all programs and values. It's also practice is also organizational practice, and there hasn't been a lot of support for that. And why I think there are lots of folks like you who are content leaders, but maybe don't feel the power and leadership within the whole system that you're working in.
Yeah, that's well said. All right, we have one more, and then we'll break.
Hi, everyone. I'm Melissa Martin-Javerbaum, and I'm with Council of American Jewish Museums. I'm so glad to be here and have been thinking so much about these issues and have so many things I want to say in response to what we've been talking about. But a few things that are standing out to me is, first of all, I'm a true optimist in the potential of our fields, even in the toughest of times. And as you could imagine, I have a brightly colored scrapbook in my head of the past year of what working through democracy might look like for a lot of our museums. My heart stopped when Vedet talked about the way that churches are protected and museums are protected. And that's how I always felt about Jewish cultural spaces until 20 years ago, when I start to see synagogues and museums be the battlegrounds of the culture wars, and not just idea battlegrounds, but on people and bodies. So what I'm reminded with, though, is that we have the deep toolkits, sensitivities, knowledge to lead and to bridge these divides that we are all feeling. And that is where we must exercise leadership. And the question is coming, that in a lot of the great conversations I have with Braden Painter, who's here from the Coalition of Sites of Conscience, is we also talk about these ecosystems that become the gravitational grounds, right? We've seen it with the education systems and the ways that state requirements have become a battleground. We've seen it with libraries and book banning. Guess what? Museums are right there. So what are the skills that we're going to need to exercise leadership? And as Anthea says, deep preparation. What is that deep preparation? Because our communities are counting on us. So I just want to take that as both the challenge and the opportunity, and ask the panelists if they could lead off with a word of what does that deep preparation or that flavor feel like or look like? What might we think about?
Oh, with one word? Okay. Who wants to go?
I don't have one word, but I think it's, fortitude and tenacity. We're going to have to be buoyant, have some buoyancy and really be nimble, because the things that are coming our way are heartbreaking, but also I feel that we do need to have some type of defense. So there's the word, defense. I do think that we need to start coming up with some really great planning as a field, as we are about to be attacked, and just really, writ large, not just for our culturally specific museums, but as the field writ large, like what could we come up with? And I hear you raising your hand to do that, Melissa. Thank you so much.
I'm there.
I would just say be prepared to make the whole argument vigorously. So again, not being a museum person, but importing this from the lesson of higher ed of the last 20 years or so, I think, particularly in public higher ed, where I spent most of my career, we spent a lot of time trying to avoid explaining why we do the stuff that seems weird, why it's important for working class kids to learn the humanities, for example. And so we spent a lot of time talking about medical advancement and science and technology. And now we're reaping that, the results of that, which is those are the only places that we have legitimacy. And so, I think my suggestion to you coming into this is be prepared to make the whole argument for everything that you're doing, rather than trying to sort of find the pieces that seem most palatable.
I would say relationships too. I mean, I know that sounds hokey, but I've been talking to a lot of people recently about, polarization, and one of the things people are afraid to actually have like social relationships anymore with people who are opposite to them, and that's including in our halls of Congress. So you have staffers who are afraid that if they go out and have a beer or talk to someone, it's going to come back to haunt them. And I think we need to be really thinking about how do you have these relationships that you can use in good times and bad times, right? And that people are people, and we should have, we shouldn't have to always just think about what was the famous Kennedy, Ted Kennedy used to go out with, they'd go with Buckley, and they'd have these huge debates constantly about policy ideas, and then they go have dinner. And we don't have that ability anymore to have dinner.
Yeah, that's a good one.
I guess if I had one more word, it would be courage, which I think all of us exhibit, but we'll just need deep reservoirs, of support. So.
Vedet had all the words, so.
Sorry,
no, but I like buoyancy.
Oh, that's a
I
good
liked
one.
that one. I like
that was one of my SAT words in Jersey.
The image. I like the image of that because it's also positive. It's hopeful.
All right, I think we're only 15 minutes over. Let's thank our fabulous panelists.